Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our TNT session. Today we have Dr. Yhnell with us, and it's been a great pleasure for me to introduce her. She is a passionate and multi-award winning educator and science communicator. She won the Society for Neuroscience Educator Award in 2024 and National Teaching Fellowship in 2023 and is currently Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion and Reader in Neuroscience in Cardiff University. Emma now teaches the next generation of building scientists as a teaching and scholarship focused academic. Emma delivers engaging and interactive sessions with passion and infectious enthusiasm, and she has built a reputation for her ability to untangle the academically technical and translate it into entertaining, relevant, and engaging content. So it's wonderful to have you here today, Emma, and I let you take it from me from here. I think we can start the session.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was a lovely, kind introduction. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. It's very hot in the UK in Cardiff, where I am at the moment. I'm sure it's the same with you. But great to be here. And today I'm going to be talking about science communication and how communication, in my view, is core to competency. So I have a presentation, and then I'm really keen to keep it quite interactive and open up to questions. I feel I should explain the picture that is on the screen before we begin. So this is a picture that was taken during the pandemic when we moved all our teaching online, and I was trying desperately to engage our students. So this is me talking about the concept of neurotransmission, hopefully in quite a fun way with lights and plushy toys. But before we get onto that, I wanted to set my talk really in terms of the fact that often in academia we think of an ivory tower, we think of specialist knowledge, sometimes maybe quite elitist knowledge. And sometimes the knowledge and the information that we are learning isn't maybe accessible to lots of people. So in today's talk, I'm going to run through a bit of a context, some of my motivations and interest and background. Then I'm going to talk about why I think this type of work matters. And then I'll reflect a little bit on what you can do if you're maybe taking your first steps into science communication and public engagement. So whereas academia is really ivory tower based, I'm all about trying to break that ivory tower down, make academia and science and research as accessible and as inclusive as possible through communicating it to diverse and different audiences. So a bit of a timeline for you to give you some background on my career and where I'm coming from here. So I started off actually as a biochemist. The reason I started off in biochemistry is because at school I liked biology and I liked chemistry, and I just put the two together. I didn't have any family experience of university. In the UK, we would call this kind of first generation university student. I had a lovely time. I enjoyed it very much. I love learning. I still love learning. Um, but I was clear that I wanted to stay on within higher education. So I decided to do quite an interesting switch over to behavioural neuroscience for my PhD. And lots of people asked me about that, why that was. Yes, the topic was interesting, but there was also an element of which PhD would take me. My PhD was looking at murine models of Huntington's disease. That was great. Again, I really enjoyed it, but during my PhD, I really found a passion for communicating science, teaching as well. And I realized that maybe pure lab science wasn't for me. So I managed to then get a fellowship in the Neuroscience and Mental Health Research Institute in that fellowship, I was really fortunate to work with patients and families impacted by Huntington's disease as a scientist rather than a clinician. And what I was looking at was, can computer game brain training be beneficial for people and their families living with Huntington's disease? It was a feasibility study. That was a 3-year study. Again, very much enjoyed it, but I was trying to find money all of the time, find funding. And I had a bit of a reflection that I didn't want my career to look like that. I didn't always want to be fighting for income and money to keep members of my lab employed, to keep myself employed. So I also managed to do a postgraduate certificate during that fellowship in clinical trials. At that time, I thought I might like to be a clinical trials manager. Um, I didn't. I had a bit of time to experience some of the clinical trials, and that wasn't really for me. So then I began my time as a lecturer at Cardiff on what we call at Cardiff a teaching and scholarship focused pathway. So this is all about improving learning, improving the educational experience, in addition to the delivery of teaching. And then over time, I kind of worked my way up the academic tree, if you like, senior lecturer, associate dean for equity, diversity, inclusion, and now reader at Cardiff. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a background on my career so far. I also wanted to talk about some of my personal motivations. So, when we talk about storytelling in science, as long as you're happy to, sharing personal motivations can be a really powerful way of engaging audiences. And this is actually a picture of me. I am one of triplets, me and my sisters that you can see on the screen there. But for me, I was involved in science literally from the day I was born and prior to that, because we are the result of 12 years of IVF fertility treatment that my parents had. So I feel very lucky to be here. But also, when we were born, quite quickly, we were enrolled on a clinical trial for a drug called surfactant to develop our premature lungs. And actually, one of my colleagues who has just retired was one of the members of staff on that clinical trial. So at his retirement party, I went and said, thank you for literally saving my life, because my lungs are very happy and healthy. I should say we're all very happy and healthy. But I think it's interesting to reflect on the importance of science in everyday life more generally. Here we are, more grown up. Oh, I should have said I'm on the left in this photo. Um, this is my mum and dad then as we grew up. I think there's a really interesting nature nurture discussion. So my sisters and I are very different. Claire is on the left of your screen. She's a veterinary nurse. Kate, who is in the middle, is a firefighter. And then me on the right, not looking at the camera, always causing trouble. I am in science. So for me, my family were never really in science. My mum is amazing and I love her dearly, but science isn't really her thing. I vividly remember sending my PhD thesis to my mum to read and to proof. And she said, I don't know what these words mean, but I think you might need a comma after the fifth word in the fourth paragraph. So my background is very much a background that isn't really science or academia, but I think there's room for everybody, and it's important that everybody can access science and research. Also, these are my dad's parents, my grandparents, and both of my grandparents were impacted quite severely by dementia, Alzheimer's disease specifically. So I use this in my teaching, in my public engagement to talk about the real life experiences of having a family who are impacted by that. This is by no means something that's uncommon. A lot of people have lived experiences of dementia. But I like to introduce this as a topic just because I think it makes things more personable. But I would say if you are going to introduce anything like this into your talks, please just be mindful of seeking consent and permission to do so. So I have written talks and delivered talks on Alzheimer's disease. Before doing so, I just checked with my entire family, but particularly my dad, that he was happy for me to share this, particularly when I was talking about things like genetic risk, because they can be and are very, very personal. So just check that everybody's happy if you were to do anything like this. Okay then, so my motivations in terms of exploring public attitudes to science. So in the UK, our government every few years publishes what they call the Public Attitudes to Science Survey. This is a survey that takes in a diverse group of people from across the UK and asks them questions about their attitudes to science. I think we as scientists are very lucky. We are living in a society and going to work every day where we have the privilege of benefiting from education. And broadly, we've probably had really good experiences with science. We may have been fortunate enough to have incredible school teachers, mentors, peers within our scientific journeys. I certainly have. But we have to accept that the vast majority of people in the UK, at least, maybe don't have that experience. So what you can see on the screen here is what people broadly associate with science. So people are asked, when I talk about science, tell me in your own words what comes to mind. And you can see that word cloud there of the different responses. And the things that jump out of this for me are people's perceptions and attitudes towards science in the UK are very heavily influenced by the experiences they had at school. So in the UK, we teach science very separately. We teach biology, chemistry, and physics as three separate courses. School comes up there, research, space is quite common too. Bunsen burners and test tubes come up. But I found this really interesting, and this was something that came out during the early days of my lectureship. Another thing I find fascinating from this survey is where most people find out about scientific research findings. So in academia, we are under a lot of pressure to publish in peer-reviewed, high-quality academic journals, and that's important. Publishing is a whole different talk, but we have to accept that the vast majority of the public are not going to get their research information from scientific journals. What we see, and you can see in the graph on the screen here, this is taken from 2014 and 2015, 2014 in that purple colour, 2019 in that blue colour. Most people in the general public are getting their scientific research findings from news programmes, television programmes, and social media. Now, there are pros and cons to this. You can see Facebook had a huge increase actually from these years. You can see traditional print media had a decrease. We're seeing a slight decrease in TV news programmes. This survey has been repeated. I'll bring that up later. But I think it's really interesting to reflect on the broader elements of science here and the impact that you can have as a scientist in terms of sharing not only your research, but your passion for science. Scientific journals comes up here about 5% or so. As I say, these surveys have been repeated. All of us were waiting for a survey to come out after the pandemic. And all of a sudden, 3 surveys were dropped quite quickly. So here we have Britain Talks Trust in Science, published by the Wellcome Trust in collaboration with More in Common. We have Science for Society, published by the Royal Society, and then the Public Attitudes to Science in 2025, which is a follow-on survey from that 2019 survey that I mentioned. So I think there is a broad interest in science in the general public, how science is funded, how science is regulated. You can by all means delve into all of these surveys if you would like to. But this is a real area of interest for me in terms of how we talk about science and how we can modify it for different audiences. So back to my PhD then. Here I am in the lab doing science. This is me staring at a conical flask of fruit juice in the lab doing science, apparently. But it makes for a good photo, I guess. I really enjoyed my PhD. I had a fantastic lab. I had great postdoc support as well. And I managed to publish from my PhD too. But what I really found probably the most enjoyable actually was when we had groups of school children or visitors or undergraduates in the lab, and I was able to show them what I was doing and train them and share my passion and love for science. So we have something in the UK called the STEM Ambassadors Programme, which is a fantastic programme where essentially schools can say, we would like a scientist to come in and talk about Huntington's disease. And then the programme have a database of people that they can go to, and they can email me and say, Emma, a school down the road would like you to come in and talk about Huntington's disease, and then I can go and do that. They sort out all of the regulations, all of the paperwork and administrative work. And also, it's just a bridge between the scientists and the schools. So, although I really loved my PhD, there were definitely hard times during it. And I found that going into schools, talking to school children, and having that refresh of a young person telling you that your job is really cool, to be such a refreshing kind of energy forming time. So that was really, really great. Also incredibly challenging, requires a lot of energy, a lot of effort. Young people are incredible. They ask the best questions about your research. But I was mindful that there was a subset of society that were having access to science. So during my fellowship, this was the work I was doing, looking at cognitive training in the clinic, working with patients and families. It was a 3-year fellowship. I was working in this building, which is a building in Cardiff at Cardiff University. And what I was really struck by was one day a patient came in and I was recruiting people to my trial. So I would often hang out in the waiting room to try and talk to people. And I also had a bit more time probably than some of the medical professionals. So I was in the waiting room and a patient came in and they had a research paper printed out that they had brought into the clinic. And they said to me, Emma, I just don't understand what this is. This is a paper that's talking about new treatments for Huntington's disease. So if you're not familiar, Huntington's disease is a genetic condition. It's a 50% chance of passing it on to any children. It's autosomal dominant. And unfortunately, after diagnosis, it is fatal about 10 to 15 years after the onset of motor symptoms and diagnosis. So this is a condition which is absolutely such a challenging and sad condition. And the research that was going on was literally about trying to form treatments for that condition. But unfortunately, the people who the treatments were designed for didn't have access to this information. So this patient was saying, Emma, I've printed out this research. He may well have paid for it as well, because it was maybe not open access. It may have been hidden behind a paywall. And it wasn't his fault. It was just written in very academic language. Ultimately, the audience for the publication didn't match the audience that I thought it was designed to serve. So that really ignited a passion for me about making science accessible, particularly for patient groups, but also for future generations and for the general public. So this part of my talk is really some top tips, offering some top tips if you are thinking about going into this type of work and broadening some of your talks and delivering to different audiences. So I think the main thing I would say is to have a think about what you are presenting. And in science, the classic scientific method, we often present our results. That's really important. You will have worked really hard for those results. They may have taken years to create. But I would challenge everybody to think more broadly about what you're presenting, because actually presenting the rationale for a study can also be really interesting and also be really captivating. You don't just have to wait until the results to present. You can also present more broadly. I've got a slide coming up about audiences, but I'd just be really clear on what you are presenting and maybe what 3 things you want your audience to take away from your presentation. Also thinking about how you're presenting in the increasing digital world. We're online today, which is brilliant and very accessible, but it is slightly different to presenting in person. It can be a bit more challenging to keep the attention of the audience in an online setting versus in person, for example. So have a think about how you're presenting, whether that's through a PowerPoint, whether that's through props, and how you would like your presentation to come across. Who you are presenting to is a real challenge as well, thinking about who your audience are. So every time I deliver a presentation, I try and have a bit of a flavour of who the audience might be. So whether that is school children or fellow academics or general public audiences, actually working out where you're starting from is really important. I like to make the analogy of this is a bit like building a house. Start with the foundations. You can never go wrong with starting with the foundations. If you're in a talk and somebody pitches it too high and they lose your interest from 5 minutes in, they've probably lost you for the rest of the talk. If you're building those foundations, repeating knowledge, yes, there may be some specialists in the room that know that information, but that's okay because you're bringing everybody in the room with you along on that journey. And maybe if you're building that knowledge within the last few slides, you may have some really specialist knowledge that maybe not everybody is aware of, but you've kept them for the majority of the talk, which is important. And when we talk about audience, I would also encourage everybody to think quite broadly about who your audience might be. So when I think about my research, a very typical audience, the one you might think of at first, is Huntington's disease family members and people affected by Huntington's disease. But actually, I would encourage everybody to think more broadly about this, because when we think about the bigger picture, this research has different potential audiences. So for me, as scientists, I think we have a moral obligation to converse and communicate with the public in understanding science and research. I think communication should be a core value of scientists and a core competency of our training. Unfortunately, we don't train all scientists in this at the moment. But if we did, I think it would be fantastic because we could inspire so many more people and help them understand science, research, health, conditions that are affecting them and their family. So I think as scientists, as researchers, we should be flying the flag for science and research in all forms. Just to give you an example, as a neuroscientist, often I would go to events, parties that were with non-scientists, and people would ask me what I did. And I often would say neuroscience. And then they would kind of gently back away and almost become a bit scared. That's because I don't think neuroscience talks enough about neuroscience. There's a perception that it's only for clever people, which is not true. And that it's a very complex science that people just shouldn't or won't understand. That's just not the case. When we think about other audiences then, particularly for Huntington's disease, increasing awareness of rare conditions and disorders. So speaking to patients in clinic, a lot of them would come to clinic and they'd say things like, I just wish more people knew about Huntington's disease, so that when I was talking to my employer and I'd just been diagnosed, they understood a bit more. Or when I was talking to my friends and family, they knew what this condition might look like. So throughout my work, there's a big piece for advocacy and awareness of different genetic conditions, particularly Huntington's disease. More generally, thinking about brain health and disease, if I only ever talked about Huntington's disease, it may be considered a bit niche, but also it can be quite a heavy topic when we're going into schools, talking to 4-year-olds. I tend to talk more generally about brain health. There's a slide coming up later about some jelly brains that we use. But this is important for all of us. I think all of us need to look after our brain health, protect and prevent diseases. And then finally, genetics. As a biochemist and a person who's got biosciences more generally and an interest in them, this is a really interesting gateway in to talk to people about some of the moral and ethical dilemmas about genetic testing. You can test for Huntington's disease, which opens a lot of really interesting ethical and moral questions up as well. So I would always encourage people to think about the bigger picture in terms of audience. When we zone down into the different audiences then, here is an example of one of those activities that I've done previously with school children. What you can see on the screen there is an activity that we called Do It Yourself Brain Surgery. So you can see that I made these jelly brains, they're molds, and very kindly some colleagues within the imaging facilities allowed me to put one of these brains through the MRI scanner, and I hid berries within the brain so the children could use the MRI scans and the brains to try and pull out the berries from the brains. This activity was designed with school children in mind, designed to be really fun. What we actually learned from this was that parents loved it, school teachers loved it, everybody loved it. Just a really lovely, engaging way to get people talking about the brain. And some lovely feedback there from the students too. Patient groups too. So in terms of patient groups and recruiting to clinical trials, we know that clinical trials often struggle to recruit to sufficient levels or the target that they need to recruit. And I also know that when we talk about recruitment to trials, when I go and deliver a public talk, we can actually correlate it to see that there is a direct increase in recruitment to trials. So by getting out there and talking about your research more generally, it can have that sort of effect. I would also say, with a note of caution around sensitivity as well, particularly when we're talking about diseases and disorders, just be mindful that there could be anybody in that audience who is living with that condition, who has just been diagnosed, who has just had a family member diagnosed. So I just always encourage people to be very mindful of that when we're talking about conditions and the language that we're using. General public and new audiences, probably my favourite type of audience actually, because it's so varied. In a general public audience, you could have retired professors, you could have children, you could have anybody. That's part of the fun for me. And on the screen here, you can see me in the centre, the town centre of Cardiff, on a soapbox. So this is an activity which was designed to raise the profile of women in science. This is soapbox science, trying to engage the general public in science on the streets. So you have to think quite carefully about how you do this, because these are people who are just doing their shopping, walking along the streets of Cardiff, who are coming across science in quite unusual places. And that's one other point I wanted to make. When we as scientists are talking about our research, things like science festivals are really important, but just the advertising of science in science festivals can be quite off-putting to some audiences because they just don't think science is for them, which is such a shame. Different types of science communication. So, if you are thinking about doing more science communication, there are lots of ways you could go about this. I've probably focused on talks, but there are many different ways you can engage people in science. And as I am talking about these, have a think about which ones naturally resonate with you, which ones you think, oh, I'm quite good at that form of communication, but equally have a think about which ones scare you or maybe make you a bit nervous. So we have traditional print media, things like newspapers, posters at conferences, a communication form you might be more aware of. It's a bit more academic, maybe a bit more within the kind of academic norms. Social media, although Twitter is a little bit gone now, I think. Videos and vlogs, public speaking, there are things like TED Talks and TEDx Talks. Science festivals, this is Cheltenham Science Festival, so that is recruiting a crowd which are already interested in science, I would say. Popular science, so this is a popular science book that I had the pleasure of writing with colleagues for DK that's aimed at young people and children. Things like YouTube, traditional journal articles, which absolutely have their place in the bigger picture of communication. TikTok that I haven't ventured into yet, that's the one that scares me a little bit. But the point of this slide is to say, yes, be yourself. That's really important. Be comfortable. There will be styles of communication and types of communication that really appeal to you. But I would also encourage you to be brave, to give the things that scare you a go, as well, so that you are developing as well within your communication styles. So lots of different ways you can communicate. In the world that we live in as well, we have greater access to digital communication too, which comes with challenges and opportunities. Media engagement. So I was really fortunate to be approached to create a radio series for BBC Radio Wales that focused on dementia. This was a radio series that used my personal story, but we also went around Wales to interview patients, to talk about research, to take people into a memory clinic to think about what it was like to get a diagnosis. And I'm really proud of this. It's not available anymore, sadly, for various reasons. But I know that this radio series had an impact because people literally wrote in and said, you know, my dad was diagnosed after listening. Thank you for putting this together. Because of this, my mum had the confidence to go to a clinic. And I'm really proud of that. The impact of that is phenomenal. And yes, it's not a publication, but I know that the work that we did on this series literally changed people's lives, and I am, as I say, really proud of that. We also have the Science Media Centre in the UK, which is an organisation that says when the media does science better and scientists do the media better, trying to improve that collaboration. A lot of the time, people are very worried about engaging with the media because they think their science will be taken out of context, will be elaborated, will be twisted in a way that's not appropriate. So that is all about building the collaboration between the two. Given, you know, I showed you data earlier on general public seeking their scientific information from media outlets, I think that's a really key area that we could do more in. This is a really important question, the why bother question. So I present talks like this and deliver training quite a lot. And sometimes people very fairly say to me, Emma, I've got a lot on my plate. I'm doing my research, I'm doing my teaching, I've got children to look after, I've got parents to look after. Why bother with doing this additional activity? Well, I would say research is often funded by charities and taxpayers. Anytime I'm doing research, I'm thinking of people putting money into charity boxes. So I think we have a moral obligation to give back. We are in a really fortunate position, and I think often we don't take a step back to appreciate that. It helps improve, sorry, that should say transferable skills. Um, by giving talks, adapting your communication style, thinking about those different communication methods, you are building such a skill set that will serve you well, not only in academia, but more broadly. The fact that I give so many talks and presentations has been massively helpful for things like job interviews. We desperately need it in a world of increasing misinformation, disinformation, people questioning science. We need advocates for science to come out and speak up for it. To inform others, this is a fairly old photograph actually of Westminster in the UK Parliament. I don't often like to look at how much science or how many members of Parliament have science degrees because it's not many often. But we are living in an echo chamber, essentially, a small section of society that loves science, has a great passion for science, but that isn't necessarily reflected more broadly. And when people are making decisions about policy, about the way that we live our lives, about how the country is governed, I think they should be informed by data and science. And finally, because it is fun with a big asterisk. So, yes, it's fun to do this type of work, but that shouldn't undervalue it. Unfortunately, I think we live in a society where we think if something's fun, it isn't valuable or meaningful. Because I enjoy it and because it's fun, it's still hard work. It's still a lot of evening and weekend work. So it is fun, but also that comes with challenges. I also wanted to touch on teaching. I don't know if you do much teaching, but for me, when my lectureship began in 2019, this is what I was greeted with. Lots of black screens in a Zoom room. All of our teaching was online. But for me, the skills I had developed in science communication were absolutely vital in making my teaching engaging. So for me, teaching and science communication are hand in hand. I'm effectively communicating science through teaching to different audiences, and they are becoming more specialised in their degree as they learn. But it naturally, there is a crossover and an overlap for me in terms of delivering innovative teaching, using things like polling to keep people's attention, music, sharing pronouns, and actually keeping teaching really engaging. So I often have demonstrations in my lectures, props, draw-alongs. And yes, this takes time and more resource, but actually we know, particularly for our young people, their attention spans are decreasing. They are living in a world where maybe 10 minutes is too much. So to ask them to sit through a 50-minute lecture is challenging. So how can we tell stories, as I said earlier about my grandparents? Using props, using things like vision changing goggles and asking two volunteers to throw a ball between each other. And finally, just to mention my cats, Peter and Peggy. Not only do they appear in my lectures to make them more fun, but there's also ways of integrating them. So some seminal work by Thomas Graham Brown on the neuronal control of stepping was done in cats. So I use them as part of the storytelling. So I would see all of my lectures as performances and stories that I'm helping my learners understand science through those mechanisms. Collaborations are absolutely key in this space. You can see a few examples on the screen there, whether that's through charity organisations or publishers, work experience. For me, if we get science communication right, there's a real opportunity to increase engagement, which then gets more people involved, which then makes things more diverse and inclusive. Learned societies do this well, media engagement as well. So just a note on collaborations and the importance of them. I also wanted to be really honest about some of the challenges that this work comes with. Sometimes I feel a little bit like the image on the screen there, but I think it's important to recognise that often these activities happen on evenings and weekends. That's challenging for people with caring responsibilities. And also that communication is a tough and undervalued skill. It's not something we train in academia. It's not something we value, and I think we should value it more. Often people think that that's easy, but it's really, really not. Also, we have limited time, limited funding. So it's important if you can to put in grant applications to fund this type of work. And then also confidence. As I say, I deliver lots of training in this space. One of the big barriers is confidence, people believing in themselves. So if your only barrier to completing this work is you don't believe in yourself, please start believing in yourself. Confidence is important. Few final slides then on money. Getting grants to do this type of work is important. I don't think we should be doing this work unfunded because that contributes to the lack of recognition and reward. So on the left of the screen here, you could just see an activity we called Giant Genes, which was a small amount of money, I think £1,500, that the Biochemical Society had advertised, which we were successful in to develop this game and evaluate it. Small grants are also a really useful way if you're an early career researcher of demonstrating you can bring funding in. And then larger grant proposals are rarer, things like salary time. But these things always cost more than you anticipate. Funders are increasingly recognizing the value of this type of work. I mentioned publications earlier. They absolutely have their place. For me, an absolute revelation was learning that you could publish in science communication in itself, thinking about the evaluation of activities. So just two examples for you on the screen there. Fairly old now, but from 2019, the Why We Do Research campaign, which is a campaign that looked at raising awareness of research through Twitter when it was fashionable. And then on the right of the screen there, you can see the Giant Genes activity that I had some photographs of earlier, again, looking at the evaluation of it. So publishing in science communication is absolutely a thing. And I think in terms of demonstrating impact and speaking the academic language that our institutions are so used to, it can be a nice way of demonstrating value. As I come to the end of my talk then, just to reflect on the fact that not everything has always worked out. I think the challenge with these types of talks is often it can come across as just a success story. So many things have not worked out. I think June was the June just gone, I got more rejections in my professional career than I've ever had in a single month. Academia is hard, it's rough and tough. So we do need to celebrate our successes, but recognize when we are living in a social media world, people celebrate them and they don't necessarily talk about the rejections, the failure, sacrifice that goes along with it. Finally, nerves, confidence, and imposter syndrome. So I have worked with some incredible people who are literally physically sick before presentations. I used to be somebody who got incredibly nervous before presentations. I wouldn't sleep well, my mouth would go dry. I would expend a lot of energy and anxiety and nerves. There's something to be said for doing it more regularly because it does get easier. I love public speaking now. I don't lose sleep. I get a really good night's sleep before public speaking. And building this. So when we talk about nerves, thinking about the physiological processes behind our nervous system, why we're nervous, what's driving that. For lots of people, the questions at the end of a talk can be more nerve-wracking than the talk itself because you can't plan for them. And just thinking about why you're nervous and actually, is that a positive thing because you care? And that's really, really important too. So if you are somebody who's nervous, have a think about why you're nervous and what you might be able to do to overcome that and be a bit braver. Few other resources that I wanted to mention: the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement in the UK, some specialist journals of science communication I wanted to flag, information about the STEM Ambassadors Network, although I appreciate that is your UK-based network. And then finally, I love ending my talks with this quote, by being yourself, you put something wonderful into the world that was not there before. A lot of my work pushes the boundaries, challenges, is doing stuff differently. And I think that's brilliant, but also has its challenges. So with that, just to say thank you, diolch yn fawr, which is Welsh for thank you, and I am more than happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.